Well, thanks for coming. I'm Jane Seagrave. I'm the publisher of the Vineyard Gazette, which is a sponsor of this festival, a wonderful old newspaper, a little older than me. It was founded in 1846. It was acquired 2 years ago by Jerry and Nancy Kohlberg, who are people who care a great deal about the future of journalism, and I'm honored to work for them. We all should be happy that they came into the life of this great institution. But today I'm also honored to be moderating this panel on the future of journalism with some exceptional panelists. Let me introduce them. I think we'll figure out the future in 50 minutes or less with these great brains to help. Starting from the far end is Kevin Cullen. Kevin, many of you know, is a longtime reporter and probably best known now as a columnist for the Boston Globe, reporting on Whitey Bulger, a co-author of one of the couple of terrific Whitey Bulger books. Kevin, not quite got this right. Kevin is a longtime journalist, a longtime Boston Globe reporter and columnist. He was on the Pulitzer Prize-winning team for the pre-sexual abuse scandals in 2003, I think.
For which I'll go to hell. That's what Father Flanagan told
with
me.
Whitey Bulger.
Kevin says he specializes in writing about ordinary people, but I think what he really does is stands up for ordinary people against powerful forces, including gangsters and politicians and corporate interests. Bishops. Mark Leibovich is the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. He's based in Washington, D.C., where he may or may not be welcome after this terrific book gets around. I should show you each of these books. Here's the Kevin Cullen Whitey Bulger book. You can buy them after the session here. This Town, written by Mark, is truly entertaining, and I think it's fair to say that it's a biting look at inside the Beltway. Definitely worth a read. My daughter stole it off my bedside table before I could finish it, but she's finished it and said it was great. Mark won a National Magazine Award for his cover story in the magazine on Politico's Mike Allen, and he also previously worked for the Washington Post and the Boston Phoenix. Finally, David Wessel is economics editor for the Wall Street Journal, where he also writes the Capital column. You probably heard him on NPR's Morning Edition, probably seen him on Washington Week. He's also been part of 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning teams, one at the Boston Globe for a series on racism, and the other for stories in the Wall Street Journal in 2002 on corporate wrongdoing. His latest book, Red Ink, is slim volume, but really everything you need to know about the federal budget and why we should care about the deficit. So that's by way of introduction. Gentlemen, you all do a lot of different types of writing and reporting, but I think the common thread here is that you've used the vehicle of fact-based reporting to tell truth to power. And I think you probably will agree with me that that's a central objective of journalism. Do you think that's endangered these days? And if so, why, and what can we do about it?
Oh, not at all, but I would just like to tell everybody how much I admire John Henry. And I actually think it's funny because the biggest problem, particularly in what we all do here, is that the funding mechanism, the money fell out, and it fell out because we classified advertising was the juice that produced great journalism, and we've lost it. And in the Globe's case, I walk by it every day to find it crushing. The big space where all the ladies from South Boston and Dorchester who would answer, Globe classified, has been replaced by a bunch of 24-year-old kids with Apple products. I can't get an Apple computer from the Globe, but they will give Apple products to these kids, and they're all in there trying to figure out how to monetize the web, how to make money off the web. Because let's face it, what's happening is what we do is moving from a print form to a digital form. And I mean, I actually think the greatest thing for the future of the Globe and all other newspapers in America is the iPad and other tablets and other mobile devices that create a format that it's very comfortable to read, as opposed to even a computer or a laptop. But what we're really talking about when we talk about the future of journalism is the future of funding journalism. The journalism in America has never been better. There's never been higher standards for quality journalism. I'm not talking about Fox News and people yapping on cable news and Punditry and all that crap. The New York Times, in my opinion, still produces incredible journalism. I think the Wall Street Journal, everybody's suffered cuts, the Globe, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune. But the reality is the quality journalism that's coming out in America tends to be coming out from the usual suspects, and that's great newspapers and, to some extent, the networks who still fund journalism. But what we're really talking about is how do we pay for this stuff? How do we get people to still believe? When I talk to journalism classes at universities, these are kids that want to go into journalism, I always ask them, how many of you here read newspapers? And about 3 hands go up. And that says something to me about the sort of the gap that we've lost in generations, that young people particularly don't really necessarily believe they have to read a newspaper. So a lot of it is we're talking format, but when I talk about the future of journalism, I think we're talking about how do we pay for it.
I would agree that journalism has never been better in some ways. I would also add that journalism has never been worse. And I think, the key word that Jane used was fact-based. And I mean, that's been what we do theoretically, or that we strive for centuries. And hopefully we're getting there. But I mean, obviously the funding question is fundamental to what we do. I'm not smart enough to even talk about that. I mean, I can probably talk about it, but I don't think I have. I mean, it's been a conversation we've been having since the internet has come around, or the web has come around, and I don't think anyone has cracked that code yet. I mean, I will sort of say this. First of all, I'm a big evangelist for our field. I love journalism. I love what I do, and it's a privilege to do, and I hope that young people especially want to continue to sort of pursue this, because I think it's not only noble, I think it's essential to our way of life. So I think ultimately the danger here is that standards will sort of be defined downward to the level that it's allowed in this free-for-all. I mean, I have this term in my book called anarchy in the peanut gallery, which is, I use it to describe the way the conversation has sort of devolved in politics and in Washington in general, but that's true across our society for reasons that I'm sure you are all acutely aware of. I just hope, I hope someone can fund this. I think there are places that are making money. I think, look, I'm a print guy. I'm always going to be a print guy. I don't have a head of hair to go on TV. I don't have I want to remain a print guy for as long as possible, and I hope there are people who will read what we do. And look, the young people that don't raise their hands about reading paper, I mean, they all have their handhelds. I mean, they all have some kind of diet of information. I mean, the question is their Twitter diet going to be nutritious enough for them to survive on in the long haul? So I guess to sort of sum up, I'm not smart enough to have the business conversation here. I hope that somehow, and there's no solution here, but I hope that somehow the truth will continue to emerge and that there will be vehicles for it and hopefully a market for it.
I'm a little less optimistic. I do think that we'll find a business model someday. It might not be the Globe or John Henry or Rupert Murdoch in the Wall Street Journal, but we'll find a way to make money selling information that people want. The iPad is a great example. One of the reasons newspaper publishers like the iPad is that, surprisingly, people are willing to pay for content on the iPad that they're not willing to pay for on their PC. But I worry that we are developing a generation of young reporters who thinks the ways to get attention is to be a pundit, and some of them are ridiculed in Mark's book with great acerbity. And I think that that's a threat. That the way to get noticed is to be an opinionated blogger, sometime on your own blog. Maybe if you're lucky, you're working for minimum wage for David Bradley at The Atlantic, and if you get noticed, you can write snarky pieces for Politico. And that's the fastest way to get ahead in journalism. It's not the Woodward and Bernstein approach. And so I worry a lot about a generation that has learned that if you want to really be a success in Washington, be Ezra Klein at the Washington Post, an extremely smart guy, very analytical, very hardworking, who has chosen a side and writes a brief for that side. That wasn't the way you got ahead in journalism when I started too far years ago to count.
I picked out that line from Mark's book where he said, and I think I'm paraphrasing a little, but punditry is replacing reporting as the highest form of journalism. And you do see that on TV a lot, where people with a point of view seem to get more attention than reporters who are trying to tell you what's going on. Kevin, is that true outside the Beltway?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exaggerated in the Beltway, and I think it's a function. I think it's been created by the 24-hour news cycle, which I am not a fan of. I always remember this story. A buddy of mine from the BBC, when the BBC went 24 hours, I was covering the war in Serbia, and my buddy Mike from the BBC just had to be on air all the time, and he couldn't go on the field with us. So the BBC was on air 24 hours a day, but they weren't reporting because he had to be on the air all the time. So he was standing on the top of our hotel in Belgrade, and then we would feed him stuff because we were out in the field during the day. And this is one of the contradictions, that there has never been more news out there, but I think there's never been less reporting in my lifetime, and there's a big difference. And like I said, I guess I would be classified as a columnist because I'm allowed to engage in opinion. Somebody would put me in the punditry field. But, to the Globe's credit, I mean, I've been writing every day during the Bulger trial, because for me, that's like shooting fish in a barrel. But I write 2 columns a week, and I report them. And, I mean, if I just wanted to pop off and talk about Michelle Obama's hair, I could write that column in 12 minutes. But I try to report my columns. I think the best columns that you read in this country, or the best what we would call punditry, is actually reported. When I read Paul Krugman, I know he has his facts. I'm not really worried about that. When I hear some guy that goes on Fox News or CNN or MSNBC and just pops off, I very seldom think they have their facts, or I question their facts. I think there is a real big difference between popping off and I don't, to be honest, I've done an awful lot of TV in the last, between the marathon bombings and the Whitey Bulger, I've never done more TV, and I kind of don't like doing it because I always feel like I'm being pressured to get something down to about 9 words. It's like doing Twitter on TV, and a lot of it is, how do you characterize the quality of punditry? But we've never had more punditry, and we've never had less reporting, and that's not good.
I think also the 24-hour cycle is not limited to the BBC. The 24-hour cycle has arrived at the Wall Street Journal, where reporters are under pressure to, can you file something for the web before in the next 15 minutes, and I want to think about this as not a defense. And the things that some of our colleagues at my paper and others have put on Twitter that then we've had to go kind of pull back and repair the damage is just a sign of how the technology has removed the barriers to entry to journalism and threatened to erode any kind of standards.
I have a little object lesson in the end of my book when Bush 41 got very sick over Christmas. This is the epilogue of the book, and there was sort of a bit of a vigil. I mean, people were saying his condition is really, really worsened. He's in intensive care, and there was some sort of thought exercise in which, okay, who will be the first outlet to declare him prematurely dead? And sure enough, it was some radio station in Houston or something like that, and They were first with the news.
Permanent exclusive.
Permanent exclusive, yeah, until the next person does it. But, no, I mean, look, I think that, again, to be outrageous is rewarded, and not only is it going to be rewarded by getting yourself noticed, and then you're going to get on TV, and then you're going to yell louder to get on TV more, and then, I mean, look, it's not that complicated, ultimately. I think it's unfortunate, and I think people like Ezra Klein is an incredibly smart guy, and he's a very talented guy, and I don't know how he spends, I don't know how he does all that he does during the day. I mean, there has to be, I mean, if he had one column a day, if he could actually think about things, I'm sure it would be better. But it was, some of the best journalists I know are now really, really busy because they're trying to get ready for their 2 o'clock hit and their 2:45 hit and all that. But having said that, I recognize, I mean, you have to be an idiot not to recognize the power of television, right? I mean, I've been a print guy for 25 years. I've worked for good papers. I go to my 25, 30-year high school reunion, and no one says, oh, I read this story. They say, oh, I saw you on MSNBC at 3 in the afternoon. I mean,
I was at the gym. I had the sound off, but you looked great.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I said, I know that guy.
The other day, just an example of this, and I kicked myself, and I went back. I was doing a thing with CNN. They're doing a documentary on the Whitey Bulger trial, and the guy's talking to me, and he says, so what's your prediction? What do you think will happen today? And I should have said, what the does that have to do with anything? And what I did, I said, well, I guess if you have to put, I said, maybe, I think he probably will testify. And then like about 20 seconds go by. I said, can you keep that camera? I said, I don't know what's going to happen. I said, I'm not a mind reader. I'm a journalist. I'm a reporter. And when it happens, then we'll know what happens. But why would you ask me what my prediction is? Because it's like, I watch this, ESPN is actually on the sports side, I think the greatest offender of this. Like, they ask these guys, well, what's your prediction? And then they give a prediction and they never go back, well, by the way, we've done a report and you've been wrong 78% of the time. We think you should become a weatherman. I mean, it's nonsense. But I got sucked into it the other day on the boat when I was taking the boat up from Hingham, where I live in the South Shore of Boston, up to the trial. And I realized, and it's how seductive that crap is. A camera was on me, and my head said I should tell them to go piss up a rope. And instead, I gave them the answer they wanted. And then I came back and I said, no, that isn't what I meant. I'm not in the prediction business. Why are you asking me to prognosticate? I'm not a prognosticator.
So let me ask you a slightly different question. Since 9/11, the public has been decidedly more willing to accept government secrecy in defense of national
You
security.
think?
And the recent NSA surveillance revelations really hasn't done much to change that. Interestingly, all the polls show that people are more interested in security than they are in their rights, although, it's sort of 50-50. First of all, are you worried about people's sort of overall willingness to trade security for openness, and what does that say about us as journalists?
Well, I think that the polls are, depends how you ask the question. The latest Pew poll shows a bit of an increase in people worried more about civil liberties than protection. My wife and I had a conversation with our 23-year-old son about this, and we were horrified by the NSA stuff, and we're remembering, what happened during the Vietnam War. And I did a story at the Middletown Press about getting my Freedom of Information file and getting that the CIA had some list of people at a meeting I'd been at or something. And his attitude was, I figure Facebook, Twitter, I don't have any privacy anyways, and the government isn't any worse than these companies having it. So I think there is a fundamental and really interesting shift going on that a lot of this information people are giving up freely on Facebook or responding to these questionnaires. My sense is in Washington, whatever you think of Snowden and what he did and whether the guy had any kind of game plan, he has changed the conversation substantially in Washington. And there are a number of people, some on the left and some on the right, the libertarian right, who are really pretty exercised about this. So I look at this as nothing might change, but this could be an inflection point where we see some pushback against the government needs to know everything, because to prevent an act of terrorism is an excuse for anything the government wants to do.
I must say, when I heard the foreign minister of France get very upset about this, it reminded me of the scene in Casablanca when Claude Rains suggested he was shocked that there was gambling going on in Rick's Cafe. All governments spy. It's to what extent do they do it, and to what extent is it supported and accepted by the populace. Part of me thinks that what's been going on for the last 6 years, if it happened under the George Bush administration, more people would be up in arms. That's just part of me. Can't back it, just a sort of a gut feeling on that stuff. I think we look at Eric Holder and we say, oh, he can't be a real jerk. It's Eric Holder.
A lot of people do.
Yeah, but I think there is something changing in this sort of the body politic about this, and we have to assess. And I'll tell you one thing, being in Boston and knowing about all the the onerous security we go through, and then we know the FBI was told by the Russians to keep an eye on these two clowns, or at least the one kid, Tamerlan, and they didn't. And you think about all the civil liberties we have, surrendered. I mean, I got to be honest. I got on the plane. It took me like an hour and a half to get through security yesterday, to get on a Cessna 402 to fly down here. And I'm just saying.
Didn't you feel safe?
I felt so much safer when I went through that, And they took my belt and they looked through my belt like I might have something. And I just said,
That's because they recognize you, Kevin.
I know.
Exactly. But I mean, Richard Reed put bombs in his shoes, and we all have to take our shoes off. And all these knuckleheads go in and shoot up schools, and you can still get a gun. I don't get it. There's something missing in that thing. I think I just went off subject.
No,
I'm
it's
sorry.
Mark, you described sort of a coziness, I think, between the press and the permanent government and the government that returns to the private sector and so forth in your book.
Right. I mean, the point, I think you're right. I mean, I think one of the points in my book is that Washington is not so much divided as it is interconnected. And we have this permanent feudal class, at least in Washington. I think it's true in every major city, but I think in D.C. especially, I mean, the watchdogs are now kind of basically in the same green room with the politicians, and everyone's part of the same fame class, right? Where they're all trying to, instead of monetizing the newspaper, they're trying to monetize their public service or whatever it is to sort of get good speaking fees and good TV gigs, and I mean it's all part of the same racket. And I think if you sort of, to bring this back to the last theme, I mean, you do lose a capacity for outrage after a while. I mean, I think when you sort of throw the fact that again, you have no attention spans because the 24-hour news, we're just on from one outrage to the next. You don't really differentiate where the outrage is because people just are always, they're inundated with voices and opinions and so forth, and there's very little sort of quality control. I think essentially you have this club, right? And you have the club of people who are on TV. And then you have everyone else. And when the club of people on TV decide to move on to the next thing, that's sort of where consciousness is sort of directed. And I think it's a real problem. I think what people don't fundamentally understand about Washington is that the notion of public service has become much more given over to self-service. I mean, everyone is worried about cultivating their brand, and even if you're in office, you're worried about the next job because there is so much money there now to pay you, a lobbying gig or a pundit gig or some kind of consulting gig. And again, it creates this big feudal class in the middle of everything.
We're being paid huge money to be up here.
Yeah.
So I agree with a lot of Mark's description, and he describes a set of journalists and public servants that I recognize, and he's exactly right about the trying to build your own personal brand. I mean, if you work for a newspaper, you can hardly expect, you don't know that your newspaper will exist for the rest of your career. So that's why when you use Twitter so people know who you are in case one day the Chicago Tribune stops publishing, which is not out of the question. But I think that the other thing is that one of the advantages of the technology, the lowering of barriers to entry, is that there is a constant flow of people who step outside the world and poke pins at the balloons. And so the thing that's most encouraging is that that continues to happen. There are, quote, scandals, some of which are scandals and some of which aren't, but which often don't stem from some investigative team at the Washington Post, but someone else did it. And so there is a group of people outside the world that Mark describes in a long tradition, I.F. Stone and a whole lot of other people who are kind of outside the bubble, who have more access to all of us now than they ever did before. And that's what keeps me from killing myself after I get to the end of Mark's book.
No. Thank you. That's a good endorsement. I mean, it's a fun book, though, right? No, I actually would agree. Actually, two things. First of all, I'm now like one of these idiots who quotes from a review of his own book, but it's actually in the form of a shout out to someone else up here, which is in the review of my book by David Shribman, who's a former Globe Washington bureau chief who reviewed my book for the Times. He said one of the things, I think one of the omissions of my book, and I fully cop to this, was just a tribute to the people who actually are serious journalists who don't care about getting on TV and who would be appalled to be in books like this.
I know both of them.
And well, no, actually, David Shribman.
You do know one of them.
David Shribman referred to the three Davids, and he was not one of them. One was David Rogers, a great congressional reporter,
awesome.
along for the Wall Street Journal, now for Politico.
Formerly at the Boston Globe.
Formerly at the Boston Globe.
Espo
Yep.
of the Associated
David Espo of
Press.
the Associated Press, and David Wessel of the Wall Street Journal. And I think I completely agree. And I also would say that outsiders, whenever I talk to young people, I say, remain an outsider. Do not become too cozy and comfortable in the club. And I think one of the reasons I wrote this book was maybe as my own self-defense of becoming too comfortable in the club, and which is not a problem right now. Because
I always remember the words of that
Mission
great,
accomplished.
great journalist Groucho Marx. I would never become a member of a club that would have me.
But I mean, Woodward and Bernstein were outsiders when they broke the Watergate
Absolutely.
story. I mean, Glenn Greenwald, if you want to put him in that category, is an outsider.
Exactly.
I mean, the best stories of the 2012 campaign were written by no one on the bus, no one on the plane. I mean, if you look at, the guy who taped Mitt Romney saying that thing,
Right.
he was a busboy. I mean, David, what's his name? Jason Horowitz of the Washington Post was never on the bus, but he dug and he found the story of Mitt Romney's bullying at Cranbrook High School and
Right.
Cranbrook School in Michigan. So
Mother Jones guy.
Mother Jones,
Yeah.
David
Korn.
Although I give credit to the guy, the waiter in the back.
Yeah, absolutely.
David Korn's on TV too much to be class
And he's in the gridiron now.
Yeah, he's in the gridiron. It's true, he is.
But you just cited, every example you cited had,
Someone named David.
and women are occasionally in the press corps too. No,
Yes.
that wasn't my point. My
No,
point
that's a
actually
fair point.
was,
It is,
yeah.
yeah.
My actual point was that most of those were people employed by newspapers, which is the thing that worries you. I know most of us heard yesterday that Gannett laid off a bunch of journalists. Hundreds, I think, was the number across the country. This morning we woke up and found out the Boston Globe had been sold for a reported $70 million.
To one of the nicest guys in the world.
Just 2 decades after it was sold to the New York Times for $1.2 billion. That's quite a decline in value.
So we call a bargain.
But the question is, where are these journalists going to, how are you going to eat in the years ahead, I guess is the question.
We're going to eat because we'll be on TV. I'm actually a lot less worried about the journalists in Washington. We probably don't have as many journalists as we do lobbyists, but it's close.
Right.
But I'm much more worried
have
about
too
what
many.
goes on in the city of Chicago or the city of Phoenix or Las Vegas or Detroit, where they don't have the scale to have a bunch of people where the local public radio station is like the last remaining vestige of journalism, and it's scraping the bottom of the contributions barrel. So, and also where what I said about how fortunately there's enough outsiders to find the scandal that we miss in the mainstream papers. In a lot of small towns, without the local paper there, peering into the books or asking why is it that every contract goes to the company that has the same last name as the mayor's wife, that stuff just will never get done. So I worry a ton about what's happening at the metro level on just that reason, because they're the one whose business model is broken. mean, we'll find a new business model at the Wall Street Journal. You know, there's still people who will pay for information about business, and the Washington Post is struggling. You'll find one. The New York Times will find one. But we know what's happening to Metro and small-town newspapers. There is no business model. They're just on death watch, and there's no ICU to help them.
You mentioned the NPR model, David. I'm thinking that in the middle of my interviews, I say, we're going to take 10 minutes out for a pledge drive here.
The best thing about NPR is that I took 6 months off from the Journal to write a book about the Fed during the financial crisis, and all these people in Washington who insisted they read my column had no idea I had taken time off because they heard me on NPR in the morning.
Right.
Well, let me ask about the nonprofit model. Does that strike you as a possible way?
You mean deliberately not?
Deliberately not.
I thought I was working for a
We've been for years
nonprofit.
now. Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, there are a lot of, I guess, essentially philanthropists who are funding some of the most ambitious journalism, certainly in Washington now. I mean,
Global Post is all philanthropy.
ProPublica, but I mean, even like the Albritons at Politico, I mean, David Bradley at National Journal, what else? I mean, Bloomberg. I mean, Bloomberg's are different because they make a ton of money. But, I mean, there are a lot of magnates who actually, and John Henry, I'm sure, will lose a ton of money at the Globe. I mean, but I'm sure, but he will
is
support
one of the
it.
nicest
He is,
guys.
right. But anyway,
Yes.
Look, I mean, I guess that's one way, and NPR is obviously another example, but I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think it's healthy either. I mean, I think eventually, agendas are going to drive this rather than any kind of
Right, that's the risk.
sort of social contract, yeah.
Can I open this now up to you folks and take questions? Right there.
At the beginning, you started talking about fact-based journalism, somewhat like evidence-based medicine. You know what the evidence or the facts there are that you're looking at and which ones that you are missing. And if you're going to read one paper versus another, the sets of facts are very, very different. So I would like to hear from you. I think one of the problems that print journalism is having, or any journalism for that matter, is which facts they choose to report on, and therefore that becomes the story. And I think there's a big problem there, and I'd like your opinion on how you see that.
Well, let me start. So first of all, that's a great argument for why all of you should read many more than one newspaper, and I recommend that. I'm the last person in Washington to get 4 newspapers delivered to his house every day, but there's no reason you couldn't join my trend. Look, some of this has always been the case, right? It's not like there was some golden age of objective journalism where nothing was ever colored by the agenda of the publisher or the prejudices of the reporters. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were busy funding people who reported things that were not true about their rivals. I do think that there's a point at which I worry about what's happening in our society being reflected in the press. It is now possible to get the facts that you believe confirmed by which URL you pick or which cable channel you watch. And there was a time in American history where newspapers were very partisan, and then there was a time where the business model was you made money by being in the middle. So in Waterbury, Connecticut, there was the Waterbury Republican and the Waterbury Democrat, and then they merged and they became the Waterbury Democrat Republican. But today, and I talk about this in the book I did on the budget, you can watch Fox, which has come to one set of conclusions about the federal government's budget and deficit, and they have a set of facts that support that. And if you watch MSNBC, you start with a different conclusion and a different set of facts. What if it turns out the way to make money is to be more like Fox or MSNBC and less like what CNN set out to be? That's a huge risk, because there it is where you start with the conclusions and you find the facts to support them.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yes, over there.
Can you ask your question at the microphone so it can be part of the recording of this event?
Actually, I apologize. I stepped away briefly. That was Mr. Henry. I have to leave the island shortly because I have to pick up his dry cleaning.
There's
Go
a
ahead.
microphone back there. Who wants to speak? Go
Is it all
ahead.
right to use a phone, Mike? Great.
Yeah.
A question on perspective and thinking in journalism. And David, this may go to you, and I'm asking this a little bit risky because I haven't read your book yet. But we know there's been a topic called the federal budget deficit and the budget in the press over the last few years. What I can't understand is that, not knowing the facts, but a little bit, I'm told that somewhere between 70 and 80% of the entire budget is driven by defense, interest on the debt, Medicare and Medicaid. Yet we have this ongoing conversation in Congress about the other 15%, and no journalists step back and say, hey guys, you're really wasting our time on the 15%, not focusing on the 85%. So my question is, how do you maintain that sort of perspective as a journalist?
You sure you didn't read like the first chapter of my book? I think that's like on page 4. So, A, you're absolutely right, and B, the job of journalists is to point out what's important and what's obvious, even though it's not what's being discussed. And sometimes you have to make a case for your editors for doing that, but that's what good reporters do. This is important. I know they're all talking about the 15% of the budget that's annually appropriated, but the deficit is being driven by healthcare spending. We ought to talk about that. It's not that hard. You have to have the courage of your convictions to do it. But if you have the facts on your side, it's a whole heck of a lot easier than to say, I just don't like Michelle Obama's hair.
So why does that not happen?
I think it does happen some. I mean, I hold what we do up. The politicians have a lot of control about what you see on TV because what they talk about, other things. But it's a little hard for me to defend my colleagues against something that I don't think I'm guilty of in this case. I mean, I wrote a book because I believe there are certain facts about the federal budget and there are choices we have to make. And I thought too much journalism was about people defending their choices and not enough about laying out the facts. And one of the facts is that 2/3 of the federal budget is on autopilot, and Congress spends most of its time, including last week, arguing about the other third.
Other questions?
You had a question,
Yeah.
but can you go to the microphone? Thanks.
Hi. So you all mention young journalists quite a bit. And as a young journalist who is in print journalism, and it's going really well so far at 24 years old, what advice do you give, I guess, to me and other young journalists when we're thinking of the future and wanting to work for the next 40, 50 years? Like, do you think we should stick with print because it's doing well right now, or should we kind of just rethink what we're doing?
Yes, and yes. I mean, I think you have to separate yourself from whatever the big cosmic business crystal ball is here. But look, I speak as an evangelist here. I think that print reporting, and obviously it's going to take a lot of forms, and you'll be called upon to blog or tweet and go on TV and whatever it is. But look, it's vitally important. I think it's the foundation of much of the fact-based reporting that we're talking about up here, much of the analytic reporting we're talking about up here. And I mean, you might not get rich. I don't think any of us.
Get rich.
I don't think any of us up here got into the profession to get rich, and I don't think any of us will. Right, exactly.
What about the movie version of your book, Mike?
You know, it's actually no, but. I mean, I guess just my answer really simply is yes. I mean, for reasons I can lay out like over hours if you want to email me, but I just think that it is a great profession. I think
I
that
came
nothing
out of
is
school in 1981, the University of Massachusetts, and everybody told me I was crazy and to get into print journalism. And I never regretted it. I love what I do. When I lived in London, I was based in London for 4 years. I hung around with the richest Americans there. They're all in the financial field. And whenever we got together where we were drinking pints or playing golf, they wanted to talk about what I was doing, not what they were doing. They were making money. I was talking to gangsters in Sicily. So I would encourage you, you look like you like what you're doing. You're excited every day you go to work. You don't know how lucky you are. Stick with it. You'll
Change
be
your
great.
name to
You'll be
Dave.
terrific.
So I think
But if you
that.
want something with a little more stability, consider whip manufacturing and maybe coal mining.
So he said, be an outsider. That was really good advice. And secondly, I have a really hard time defining myself as a print reporter anymore. I mean, I'm not so worried about whether someone reads my story on the internet or on the iPad. And I accept that more and more, a greater fraction of Wall Street Journal readers will be getting it on the tablet of the internet. So it's not the paper, it's printed on is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the kind of stories with context and facts and perspective, some of which may be on video. I mean, we do a hell of a lot of video now at the Wall Street Journal, and apparently the New York Times wants to do even more. And so I don't think, I don't want to be so hung up on the print, but what we're saying is bring the virtues of print journalism that we see into the internet age, and we'll be glad you did. And we hope you're glad too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nick?
Hi, excuse me. So I wanted to sort of follow on the questions of, what does it mean to be a young journalist in this sort of changing industry? The first part of my question is that every time I tell somebody that I'm going into journalism and, I tell them I'm going into print journalism, in the knowledge that it's not so much about the paper that it's printed on, but I'm confronted with this sort of very hopeless sense of negativism of, where the industry is going and what's happening. So, how do you continue to combat that? Because I know that the journalism industry isn't failing, regardless of what everybody tells me, or rather, regardless of what people outside the industry tell me. So, one, how do you confront that? And two, some of you were mentioning that we have to continue to take all of the good virtues of journalism as it exists today and transition that to the new formats. How do you even begin to do that? And as somebody who sort of grew up on computers, what can we do to sort of ease that transition?
I think what you said, I mean, in terms of the negative, I don't like hanging around negative people, to be honest. When I was like this young lady, it sounds like you want to get into the business, you want to do it. And I agree 100% with what David said. The reality is, as a young journalist, one of the most important things you're going to be handed as a journalist is your smartphone, which you will use to record video and which you'll tweet on, and you'll do all these things. You're basically in different formats, but you're doing the same thing. And I would say, the most important thing is to do, I mean, you guys grew up, you obviously know a bit about journalism, and just do it the right way, and do it and hold up to the certain standards, and don't, I mean, it sounds like a cliche to say don't sell out, but just do it the way you've learn to do it. And I mean, it's incredible how many kids are still going to journalism school, or taking journalism classes and taking journalism majors. I think it's probably the highest numbers ever. And so I think they're being trained the right way. But I repeat what I said to that young lady. I was told the same stuff, and that was 30-something years ago. If I listened to them, I would have been a firefighter like my cousin Mark Flaherty, who actually just retired with a $70,000 pension.
Can I actually just add, I mean, just to throw a little water on this, I mean, journalists, in my experience, are some of the most negative, bitchy people I've ever met in my entire life.
Absolutely.
I love them, by the way. I mean, it's a low morale business. That was true 30 years ago. You have more, infighting and gossiping and intrigue and in the newsrooms. After a while, you kind of get off on it. But the other thing is, I mean, look, like any profession, but I think journalism is no different. It requires a lot of luck and a lot of hard work. And I guess I would sort of say that there's a story I like to tell, and because this happens periodically, and I think David and Kevin probably have similar stories. Journalist X, who is a friend of mine, who I used to work with, you hear this over and over and over again. So-and-so got a job at McKinsey, or got a job at this new public relations firm, or is now going into business with ex-politician Y. Wow, it sounds like a really great opportunity. And you look at them and they're all excited because they have like this whole new thing. And then everyone sort of talks about, hey, you hear how much she's making? Or I wonder what they're making. Like, I wonder what they're pulling down. Then you go to their goodbye party and people toast the new beginning, and then maybe you run into them a few months later and they say, yeah, it's really exciting, I'm learning a lot. And then you just sort of never hear from them again. And sometimes they go on to do their thing. Sometimes whenever you do hear from them again, it's always, yeah, I kind of would miss it. I kind of wish I could get back in. So,
all the people I know like that have bought houses on the vineyard.
I think we've only got time for one last question.
Oh,
and you're
okay.
up.
I just I started out as a reporter, but most of my career has been as an editor, and so there are very few brand called Use editors out there, but there are I think I've had a huge amount of influence on a lot of the people that I've worked with and helped to shape their stories. And I was just curious, in your own careers, like the editors that have meant the most to you in helping you to stick to your guns in the most important stories.
I think we've all had them. I mean, I have, let's see. I mean, my current editor is great. I mean, John Henry, of course, was one of the best editors.
John Henry's a wonderful
you can
editor.
ever order.
I was at I'd just gotten to the Boston Globe, and there was a guy named John Connolly who was messed up in a something involving high lie and a murder. John Callahan, and Robert Phelps, who had come from the Times, was at the Globe, and I spent an incredible amount of time doing what I thought was a great investigative job, and I turned it in, and he called me into his office, and he said, you know, this is a great reporting, but you didn't nail it. You don't have the goods, so we're not going to run it. So I kind of was a little depressed, as you'd imagine. I put it in my drawer, and about a couple months later, I get a call from a reporter at the Miami Herald saying, weren't you the guy who was doing that piece on Callahan? They just found his body stuffed in the trunk of a Cadillac at Miami Airport. So I had written the world's greatest obit. And Bob Phelps stopped me from putting a story in the paper that I hadn't nailed, and being stuffed in a trunk, that was kind of enough to push it over the edge. So I think the best editors are the ones that keep you going when you need to be bucked up, and Tom Winship at the Globe was better than that than anybody I've ever worked with. But they're also the people who tell you, you don't quite have it, let's set it aside, and maybe you'll get lucky and the guy will show up in the trunk of a car.
I think that's a good way to start. Looking for a show of hands of everyone who has worked in or now works in the journalism industry.
Wow.
Yeah, I thought it was an insider crowd.
Oh, cool.
Thank you so much.
We'll see you all on the bar.
Yeah. Thank you so much to our guests.